Good afternoon and the warmest welcome to this special debate coming to you live from the World Economic Forum, Africa 2011. As you well know by now, it's the 21st World Economic Forum to be held in Africa, and I can tell you in 2 decades things have changed. There's definitely a sea change. Geopolitically, the world is changing, a definite shift, and what we're here to talk about today is essentially that, this shift in global economics, the changing global architecture of the world, the growth in South-South cooperation. It's been said that currently, BRIC economies, Brazil, Russia, India and China, account for about 24% of global growth. With concerted effort, it's believed that within the next 5 years, they'll account for 61% of global growth. Now, of course, as you know, in April of this year, South Africa was officially inaugurated into this elite club of emerging market economies and effectively catapulted Africa onto the world stage. What we're here to discuss is whether or not the BRICS is going to offer any tangible change in relations economically, any systemic changes in the global trade regime, and any tangible benefits for what's regarded as the new African consumer, with Africa having at the very least 160 million people now earning over $5,000 per annum. So it's a sea change, it's euphoria around the sea change, but what do we need to be cautious about? Debating the question of building South-South relations here at the World Economic Forum with me, we have Professor Robert Lawrence, who's the Albert L. Williams Professor of Trade and Investment at the Harvard Kennedy School. We also have Ambassador Liu Guizheng, who's the Special Representative for African Affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the People's Republic of China. Then we have Mrs. Obiageli Ezekwesili, who's the Vice President for Africa at the World Bank in Washington. Colin Coleman is the Managing Director and Partner for Goldman Sachs here in Africa. Seated next to him is the Honourable Minister of International Relations and Cooperation for South Africa, Ms. Maite Ngwana Mashabane. And last but certainly not least is the Minister of Commerce and Industry for India, Mr. Anand Sharma. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Let me also remind our viewers that this is essentially an interactive session. So after we've ironed out some of the core issues around South-South relations, we're going to hear from some of our esteemed delegates here at the World Economic Forum 2011. Let's start with you, Minister Ngwana Mashabane. So South Africa has now become a bona fide member of BRICS, it's the S, and many have questioned the merit of South Africa being part of BRICS. They say you're just 1/4 the size of the Russian economy, it's just 49 million people. Technically, you really have nothing to offer.
Well, Lerato, good afternoon to fellow panelists and to ladies and gentlemen in the audience. South Africa's membership to BRICS was not an event, but a journey. It is a journey that was started by our visionary leaders long time ago, when they finally have been working together to fight colonialism from India to Africa, and finally said, even at that time as they were fighting for freedom and decolonization, that people of the South have to work together when they get freedom, to political freedom, to also work for economic and social emancipation. That's what brought the Bandung Conference into being. At that time, those who knew better, when the Western world was still ruling the group, thought our leaders were just but dreaming. The realization of the formation of these very, very progressive formations of the South, to us is the realization of this vision of our forebearers, which works for economic emancipation of our people in the South. And so therefore, I would want to remind the audience that leaders like O.R. Tambo at that time were invited in such gatherings, even though South Africa was still under apartheid. So for us, South Africa joining BRICS is a celebration and a homecoming of that which we waited to see happening. So therefore, politically, that is a confirmation of that which we have been part of historically. Economically, South Africa runs the biggest and most diverse economy on the African continent, the continent of Africa that has become the third fastest growing economy in the world, with very young population and with 1 billion people. Right. So we believe that we are in the right forum at the right time, and we've got a lot to offer.
All right, so that's what informs the South African membership of BRICS. Minister Anand Sharma, your views. Obviously, India's got a population of just over 1 billion people. It's growing above 8%. But tangibly, are there any gains in partnering with fellow emerging market economies?
I think political leaders must have a vision. They must connect to the contemporary realities, to history, and what the future beckons. It would be only attributed to short-sighted people who lack vision, who are looking for immediate gains, like asking for instant coffee from a coffee machine. As Mighty Mashabane, my sister, has explained, you have to be connected with history. This is not the first time that this dialogue is emerging. It was before India's own independence. It was during the struggle against apartheid and against colonialism in South Africa and in Africa, in Asia, in South Americas. Our leaders had taken a clear position during our national struggles. Mahatma Gandhi, who spent 22 years in South Africa and returned to lead India to freedom, and his fellow comrades had a deep philosophy, also understanding of the global economics. It was ideology against imperialism, of political economies, exploitation, which colonialism brought. We brought these leaders together. Now today there is a clear shift which is taking place. It's not only a shift of global economic growth, production, but more than that, it's the rebalancing. So it's not that the BRICS countries contributed 24%, as you said, to the global economic growth, and that's 25% of the global GDP, but 50% of the global economic output last year. Now, in the coming 2 years, you'll see another shift. The economies of Asia, of Africa, and North Americas will see a major transformation. But Asia, European Union, and Americas, North Americas, will be equal-sized, each contributing 25%. 85% of the world's population lives in the countries which are called developing countries, least developed countries, poor countries. 15% are outside that. Most of the resources of the world are in these countries. You had asked a question which was answered about South Africa. It was but natural. The continent of Africa has to be part of the global coalition. It cannot be that the entire Africa is left out in the global order when the political and economic architecture of the world is changing, and changing for the better, becoming inclusive, becoming democratic, becoming representative.
Okay. Ambassador Liu, we've heard some philosophical reasons to justify this grouping.
I gave you
but
the
when it comes,
also.
You did. But when it comes to China, they say it's less philosophy, it's more business. China just wants to take over the world.
Well, this time is the first time for China to be the host to the BRICS Leaders Conference. And it makes a lot of sense because it's the first time that we have a new member, South Africa. Though the size of the economy, the size of the population of South Africa is not that big, but it makes a lot of sense for the whole BRICS group and for the continent, because South Africa is a gateway to Africa, because South Africa is one of the most mature democracies here in the continent, because South Africa plays a vital and important role in the affairs of the continent, Not only that, and South Africa normally, when he decides to do something, it usually to advance the interests of the whole continent. It's not only South Africa involved. And these BRIC meetings at this time indicates that the emerging countries, the developing countries, as a bloc, as a group, has a bigger say, a louder voice. But we do not definitely mean that we have a group which is supposed to be confronting the interests of the developed world. It will serve as a bridge of the North-South cooperation and dialogue. It will serve as a platform for the BRIC countries, for the developing countries, to put our heads together to advance the interests of the whole developing world, and to promote a prosperity and peaceful world in general.
Colin Coleman, Goldman Sachs. I won't make it your problem. But Jim O'Neill coined BRICS. He's also one of those people who's coined the next 11 emerging market economies to watch. And from that stable, there's been a lot of criticism as to whether or not the grouping is going to truly change the face and the shape of the global economic architecture, and whether or not South Africa warrants to be there. Goldman Sachs still not convinced of South-South relations?
No, precisely the opposite, actually. The phenomenon, let's start at the global level. The phenomenon of growth markets is rising as the most important phenomenon in the world today. So on a relative basis, what we call growth markets, some people call emerging markets or developing markets, are becoming the source of growth on a relative basis to developed markets. And those traditional markets are really dependent more and more on the rise of China. $6.5 trillion economy, we believe, will overtake the United States. As part of the BRIC analysis was that effectively these BRIC economies are going to become the dominant economies by the year 2050. And the view of Goldman Sachs has been that institutional investors will want to know where the emerging market growth is happening. And it's really been the BRIC story, which is Brazil, Russia, India, and China, for those people who are not familiar. The BRIC story has effectively been an econometrics analysis which has built on the basis of some assumptions. And just to understand what those assumptions are, there are assumptions about populations, there are assumptions about GDP size, of GDP growth over this period. And as a consequence, the view is that over this period of the next 20 to 50 years, the BRIC economies and the next 11, which are the next largest after the BRIC economies, will become the dominant economies in the world. In relation to South Africa, if you take a cold clinical analysis of where South Africa is today, you reach two conclusions. One is South Africa is the dominant, as Ambassador Liu said, is the dominant country today within Africa to represent Africa on the world stage, and particularly within the BRIC economies. And secondly, that South Africa is a relatively small economy. If you take South Africa's GDP is $380 billion versus China's $6.5 trillion economy, 49 million population versus 1.3 billion people in the case of India and China. And so it is, from an analytical point of view, a question as to South Africa's position as a BRIC. But there's no question in the minds of everybody, myself as a patriotic South African included, that South Africa plays a very vital role as a member of the BRIC in a new geopolitical reality. And that geopolitical reality is that the BRICS are part of the global future.
Obi Ezekwesili, we've been talking for the last 20 years about the Washington consensus. Classical economics, the state mustn't be too involved in growth, those kinds of things. And now we're talking about the China consensus. Is it too early to be talking about things like that? Has the world really changed from the World Bank point of view?
I don't think that anything about the importance of macroeconomic foundations on the basis of growth have changed. Even China had to take care of the fundamentals as a basis for its growth. It wasn't until China embraced the market principles in the management of its economy that we saw the growth that happened. The same thing with Russia. I think that essentially the idea that there is some model that is going to be prescriptive and be the basis of growth of nations probably is passé. The only thing that matters today is the pragmatism with which countries are able to know that there are fundamentals that you need to take care of. To ensure that you have your macroeconomic stability as a necessary precondition for every other thing you do in order to grow is something that Africa has learned. And that's why in the last decade we saw the growth that we've seen in Africa. The next thing, of course, is how Africa then takes advantage of the opportunities of being integrated to the global marketplace. How does it embrace its own comparative advantages and then use that as a basis to actually deepen and spread out the growth so that it can be growth that comes with jobs?
Professor Lawrence, I want to capitalize on the fact that you're a professor of trade here. Have there been real, tangible gains between a collaboration of Asian, African, and Latin American countries? Certainly, we've seen trade between Africa and Asia grow about 30%. But in the greater scheme of things, Africa's contribution to world trade is still something less than 2%. So is this really having a positive impact?
I think it is unquestionably having a huge impact. I mean, conventional wisdom in 2000 was that the world economy was basically working for the developed countries and perhaps for India and China. But for most of Latin America and most of Africa, we were not seeing economic growth. Since 2000, we've seen a remarkable change. We've seen a global dynamic that has spread growth and prosperity both through the African continent and through Latin America, the Middle East, and elsewhere. So we are living in a changed world. And if we ask why, there are some external reasons. There's a cumulative effect of the kind of growth that China and India have generated, which has been heavily commodity intensive. So I think there's an external dynamic that is helping to spread the economic gains to the rest of the world. And there's also been some internal changes. I agree that you know, we downplayed the importance of structural adjustments and the so-called Washington consensus. But what's very striking is that because of that growth, countries have been able to put themselves in much stronger macroeconomic positions, and they've also undertaken a lot of reforms domestically that have put them on a far better path. So I would submit that, yes, the paradigm of global growth has improved tremendously, although there are considerable challenges.
Okay, Minister Ngwane Mashaite, let's deal with statistics here. Ngwane Mashabane, excuse me, let's just deal with statistics here. Trade between South Africa and China is now above $25 billion, and the feeling is that it's skewed very much in favor of China. If there are benefits to South-South cooperation, who's really the winner here? The general view is China is the winner. A country like India is the winner. South Africa's still lagging.
Well, I think we need a workshop before we come to this. Because the information I have is that on India, we are doing far, far much better than the information you have. And the Minister of Commerce of India is agreeing with me. We are on China. South Africa is the only African country, and largely in many of the developing South, that has, besides becoming a member of BRICS, that has a bilateral, comprehensive, strategic partnership treaty with China, which also looks at how else can we reverse the trend and make sure that South Africa, together with the bigger Africa, benefits from this very important relationship. I'll take back to what you referred to as philosophy, because I refer to that as very important history, as Minister Anand Shamet said. South Africa prides itself to have the foundations of our foreign policy on Pan-Africanism and South-South solidarity. So therefore, we are having a forum, India-Africa Forum, where we discuss these issues, where we should be bringing compatibility. Because, you see, as much as there's history behind our relationship, there's also reality that these countries are resources hungry, and Africa has a potential to offer this. But also on the African side, we are working for beneficiation of our minerals so that we don't just extract and export. Right. So that's why in this comprehensive strategic treaty that we've signed with China, we have a policy of beneficiation at source, which China agrees with, because that helps them to deal with also with environmental concerns. So there's no zero-sum game here. There's a win-win that we are working towards incrementally.
Minister Sharma, just your views here. You said no, no, no. Give us the figures. When we're talking about trade relations, how much is coming into Africa? How much is leaving Africa?
Let me tell you, when it comes to India and Africa, or are you asking only about South Africa? You said so.
Africa in general.
India and South Africa's bilateral trade is close to $10 billion. And it is heavily balanced in favor of South Africa. South Africa exports close to $6.5 billion. India's exports are less than 2.5. We are not grudging, because what India imports are the commodities which South Africa has. Same in the case of many other African countries, whether it comes to gas, oil from Nigeria, Sudan. So it's not that we are exporting. People must shed the old notions of China and India being merchant countries. We both were. That's a fact of history. 54% of the world's GDP was shared between China and India. But India was the largest trading country of the world. But today, India's share in the global trade is barely 2%. And we are 17% of the world's population. And in the coming years, in your lifetime, hopefully, definitely in my lifetime too, of the first 5 economies of the world, 3 will be from Asia in the order of China, India, and Japan. So these are the realities of the world which we must address, that we are at an inflection point of history. These changes will get reflected. And much is talked about the size of South Africa. South Africa is huge. When you look at its size, its the depth, the resources, also a functional democracy. But beyond that, what people are forgetting, it's not only the material resources, but the human resources. When I was growing up as a student, we were told that our population is huge, this is not good. Every year India adds Australia. But today, 1.2 billion, close to 70% are young. After 20 years also, India's average national age will be 29 years. Same is the case with Africa and South America. When they're changing demographics in the world, it's the human resources also which matter. And another thing what I would like to quickly add, and there'll be time to elaborate later, is that our engagement is distinct and different. China's is different from the Chinese perspective. So is Africa's with each one of us. India's growth story is not driven by exports or merchandise trade. It is by domestic demand and domestic consumption, domestic production. But far more important is that over decades, when India has been confronted with monumental developmental challenges, India has been committed, sharing its resources, sharing its technologies, capacity building, education, and there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of students from Africa who have come and studied in India. So, and even today, we have close to 40,000 students.
Growth models later on. Colin Coleman, I want to get the investors' point of view here. Obviously, we've seen more FDI coming to Africa. That's almost risen by 87%. But we're told that when you just look at it broadly, Comparatively, Africa funds versus Asia funds, you can't even begin to compare. For investors looking for yield, they're going to Asia. They're not really coming to Africa because Africa is just not competitive, because there are political risks, because there's a skills deficit, because.
That statement is frankly either outdated or wrong. Take your pick. The reality is investors today are very focused on Africa, and I'm not just talking about your exotic emerging market funds. All the institutional mainstream investors are asking the question, how do they play Africa? Now let's just, for a moment, take a reality check. The reality check is the following. South Africa is the only functioning liquid capital market on the continent. So if you want to get liquid exposure, meaning you buy a security and you can sell that security with relative ease at a fair price and know what you're getting and know you can trade, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is your most likely place to do it. So the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is a $740 billion market cap, comparable with Russia, not as big as some of the other BRICS, but a very sizable and highly functional capital market. Unfortunately, other countries within Africa do not have that functioning exchange. So Nigeria is the next largest, with approximately $50 billion market cap, which is, say, 1/10 the size of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and then Angola and Kenya are hoping to grow stock exchanges. But in effect, one of the problems for the investor community is how to play the continent. And many of them play through the South African companies, so the ShopRites, the Pick n Pays, the Standard Banks, the MTNs, who've done incredibly well. If you look at the MTN growth story around Nigeria and what they've managed to do in a very short space of time, it's an incredible testament to the investing opportunity that there is.
Right.
Having said that, I think it's important to note that there are many other ways in which the investors are playing Africa, including private equity. And there are many funds that have been created. Carlyle, for example, one of the largest private equity firms in the world, has created a Africa fund. And there are many other funds that a variety of investors are participating in.
I just want to get a quick comment from you, Professor Lawrence. Are you convinced by what's been said here? When investors are looking for yield, do they look at Africa as a potential growth market? When we're talking about trade, is the surplus in favor of a country like China?
Well, firstly, I do think we shouldn't look too narrowly at bilateral trade balances, simply because that isn't necessarily an indication of the benefits that we are receiving. But I also think we shouldn't be focusing on the past so much. We should think about the opportunities that this relationship is granting. And one of the dimensions that has been mentioned relates to more value addition in commodities. And certainly where this makes sense, I think it is appropriate. But I think we need to think much bigger than that. Because I also think that ultimately, to really deliver, which was the focus of this session, to deliver to people on the ground, we have to have more job creation. And beneficiation in large, capital-intensive, power-intensive refineries will not do it for job creation. Job creation will come from manufacturing opportunities. So the real challenge that I think Africa faces, and investors coming to Africa, is not just to have a commodities play, but to think about the manufacturing opportunities that are created as we see structural changes occur in China and the global supply chains start to move. The opportunity is for Africa to restructure itself in order to take advantage of that potential. So I would prefer that rather than look at the past and even the present, we start to focus more on the opportunities in the future, because ultimately that's what BRICS is about. We can get into debates about classification. It doesn't matter really who gets into the group. What matters is what they do once they're in the room.
Okay, thanks so much for that. We're going to take a short ad break here on CNBC Africa. We're debating, and I underscore debating, South-South relations, the idea of building greater relationships between emerging market economies. As you well know, South Africa is now a bona fide member of the elite club of Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Many have questioned South Africa's status and whether or not Africa as a continent is in a position to compete. We've heard about partnerships, but it's also competition, and we'll interrogate some of those issues after the break. Stay with us.